Good morning, bom dia. I will do this opening session in English. So I will start right now. Eminent Vice Rector of the University of Coimbra for Culture, Communication and Open Science, Professor Delphine Leão. Esteemed Director at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of Coimbra, Professor Albano Figueiredo. Esteemed Director at the Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures, Professor Paula Barata Dias. Honorable guest speaker, Dr. Vassilis Papadopoulos, Ambassador of Greece to Portugal. Esteemed researchers and technical staff at the Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies, esteemed colleagues, dear students, distinguished guests, both in the room and joining us through YouTube channel of our center. I would like to start by thanking everyone for their willingness to join us and for their interest in learning about the Coimbra Global Lectures Initiative. For its inaugural lecture, we are immensely pleased to welcome a distinguished personality known for his dual role as a diplomat and a writer. I must emphasize, as the foremost idea in these opening remarks, what a great honor it is for a center specialized in classical studies and humanistic knowledge that engages with them, a center immersed in the pulse of the present time, to host the most prominent representative in our country of the government of Greece, the cultural homeland of every one of us. However, before introducing Ambassador Vassilis Papadopoulos and his work, I will provide a brief overview of our center's new initiative, and you will receive a warm welcome from the Vice Rector of the University of Coimbra and the Director of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. For classicists, the world is their natural habitat. We have learned to navigate broad scales of space and time. We excel at connecting seemingly distant elements and never cease to amaze by the successive revelations of new discoveries from the classical world and its echoes throughout the centuries. It is characteristic of classicists to have an insatiable thirst for knowledge and a desire to engage with those at the forefront of understanding, regardless of where they may live or work, or the language they speak. At the Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies in Coimbra, a centuries-old university city, our goal is to promote a comprehensive dialogue that spans the compass, north to south, south to north, west to east, and east to west. Our mission is to foster an open exchange of ideas and deepen connections between Europe and the rest of the world in the fields of classical and humanistic studies. This is the purpose of the Coimbra Global Lectures program, through which we invite internationally renowned individuals from the various domains, scientific, cultural, artistic, and civic, that our research and development unit specializes in. The lectures will be held annually or semi-annually in person, and recordings will be made available on our center's YouTube channel. The Coimbra Global Lectures program is supported by the Faculty of Arts and Humanities and its Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures. I now give the floor to our esteemed director.
Good morning to you all. Dear Vice Rector of the University of Coimbra, Professor Delphine Leão, Mr. Ambassador of FLUC in Portugal, Dr. Vassilis Papadopoulos, dear Scientific Director of the Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, Professor Carlos Soares, dear Director of the Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures, Professor Paulo Barata Dias, also dear Director of the Department of Philosophy, Communication and Information, Professor Diogo Ferrer, dear organizers, dear colleagues, professors, researchers, and participants, dear students, dear technical staff, ladies and gentlemen. As Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of Coimbra, it is with great pleasure that I greet you and welcome you. It is an honor to have you here with us. Sorry for my poor voice today. So I would like to make only a very brief remark. First, thank you for being with us here, Mr. Ambassador. We are very pleased and honored with your presence and with your conference. I also wish to thank to our Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies for this important event. Thank you. Thank you very much to you all. And now, em português. Peço desculpas porque hoje a minha voz não está nos melhores dias e os meus alunos que aqui estão já foram torturados imediatamente antes com isso. Apenas queria também dizer que é com muita honra que a Faculdade de Letras aderiu através da nossa área de estudos clássicos, mas não exclusivamente através da nossa área de estudos clássicos, a este modelo de internacionalização em termos de pós-graduação, que a doutora Carlos Soares acabou de elencar, e em cujo âmbito esta conferência hoje também se organiza. Este é um caminho da internacionalização que todos queremos percorrer e com a ajuda de centros de investigação, de departamentos, de cursos, mas também, obviamente, de todos os serviços da faculdade, trilharemos até aos limites, com o apoio da Reitoria da Universidade de Coimbra, porque esse é o caminho que, naturalmente, uma qualquer faculdade, em particular uma faculdade de letras como a nossa, deve prosseguir. Por isso, queria também deixar este agradecimento muito particular a todos os colegas da área de estudos clássicos que se têm empenhado nesta jornada e neste modelo de internacionalização tão útil e com tão bons frutos para nós. Muito obrigado. Hoje é dia de ouvir o Sr. Embaixador e, portanto, as palavras do diretor são supérfluas. Muito obrigado pela vossa atenção.
To conclude the opening of the session, I will give the floor to our respected Vice Rector.
Kalimera Sassolos, dear Professor Albano Figueiredo, our Dean of the faculty, my own faculty, so it's really a great pleasure to be at home and come back to home. Dear Ambassador, Dr. Vassilis Papadopoulos, it's the third time that I have the pleasure to meet you, the second time in Coimbra, which is really a real deed. You gave us the honor of visiting us when you first entered Portugal with your wife. So we spent a lovely day, a lovely Saturday here. And I suppose that some seats were, let's say, left by then and are becoming to these results. The second time you received us, and us, I mean me and my colleague, Carmen Soares, the coordinator of the research, our research center, with colleagues from Lisbon University, also involved in the teaching and investigating classical studies. And we were all impressed. The first time, the second time, and certainly the third time as well, by your knowledge, your diplomacy, your wisdom, and your xenia, which in fact impacted us so much. So it is our turn to try to give this back to you, as is normal. I mean, this reciprocity that is typical of the xenia, and of course will keep bounding us and our successors for many years to come. It's also a great honor that you give us in opening or in giving us the lecture of this program, which is precisely open right now, the Coimbra Global Lectures, which, as my colleague Dr. Carmen already explained, is something that we would like to promote once or twice a year, inviting very special people to learn with them, to be aware of what is happening, people that are very much experienced, that have a lot to say, and can do it in a very special way, as you did, and you impacted us from the very first time. So thank you very much all, also from directors of the two departments involved, for giving us the opportunity to have this very successful opening, and for all those that are here, because without people attending, the idea of Agora does not work, because we need speakers, of course, we need the rectores, but we need also people attending and making questions. So thank you very much. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Before giving the floor to our guest speaker, to better prepare and engage the audience, allow me to share some insights into his academic, literary, and professional background. Dr. Papadopoulos graduated from the Law School at the University of Athens and has completed 2 master's degrees in France at the University of Nancy, one in international law, another in European Community Law. He currently serves as the Greek ambassador to Portugal and began his diplomatic career in 1986. Throughout this period, he has held significant positions in relations with the European Union and the United Nations. He has also served as ambassador of Greece to Kiev and Bucharest, and held positions at the Greek consulates in San Francisco and Bangkok. In 2020, he was appointed Chief of Staff to President of the Republic of Greece, Katerina Sakellaropoulou. Alongside his intensive diplomatic career, Vassilis Papadopoulos is also an author of fiction and essays, showcasing his role as an observant global citizen. His book, In the Far East, Impressions of a Diplomat, published in Greek in 2002 and later in English in 2020, delves into the mentalities of lifestyles of various ancient countries. These include Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, China, and Nepal. Places where the author has either worked or traveled. The book offers insightful comparisons between these Asian cultures and life in Europe, with a particular focus on Greece. Given that this book is my current and very stimulating bedside reading, I cannot resist quoting a passage for its revealing insight into a diplomat's view on the role of the fields of knowledge in which the vast majority of today's audience operates. Let us listen to the comment made by the literary self regarding the social events that diplomats must attend. and I quote, "Artists, academics, scientists, and a host of other interesting people are also often present in these otherwise insipid events." After the publication of the novel Olia to Winters and the Spring, two new works were released in 2019. Language as a Vehicle of Culture, the Impact of the Greek Language, and the other one, Diplomacy and Poetry, the Case of George Seferis. The universalist perspective of our first guest for the Coimbra Global Lectures program is also further demonstrated by his proficiency in diverse languages beyond Greek, including English, French, Spanish, and Russian. Additionally, he has delivered numerous lectures at universities and in diplomatic circles on topics ranging from politics and international relations to culture and language. Finally, the moment we have all been eagerly anticipating has arrived. I thus invite our honorable guest, Ambassador Vassilis Papadopoulos, to present his compelling lecture, the title of which in Greek suggests that just as happiness is a condition for freedom, so too is freedom a prerequisite for courage. You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
If you want to change your seat, I will stay here with you.
Esteemed professors, researchers, students, a dark cloud has been gathering over Europe and indeed over the world since 2014, or perhaps even earlier. The well-prepared Russian invasion of Crimea took European governments by surprise. Moreover, it was only the beginning of a series of ominous events orchestrated by Moscow in other countries, particularly in Europe and America. Worst of all, he didn't succeed in shaking us out of our complacency, indecision, and political short-sightedness. 8 years later, the full-scale and unprovoked war against Ukraine has revealed the truth, even to those who were still in denial about what exactly is happening to our continent. Russia's reckless megalomania is not a phenomenon confined to that country and therefore isolated in Europe. It is a sign of a deeper and universal malaise. The mentality and methods of the Russian regime have found supporters all over the world. One might ask what the autocratic kleptocracy of Russia, the theocratic intolerance of countries that finance terrorism around the world, or the grotesque communist dictatorship of North Korea have in common. The answer is simple: the utter contempt for human dignity, the absolute refusal to perceive the human being as a value. It goes hand in hand with hatred for those who defend these principles, for the countries that struggle every day to be democratic, and for the effort to build a whole international system based on the rule of law, which has cost so many lives, so much blood, and so many sacrifices for humanity over the centuries. For us Greeks, the menace to freedom and democracy, to fundamental human rights such as the right to life, to dignity, and to prosperity, is not just a political choice, an economic necessity, or an ideological position, as it is for most European and American peoples. For us, these values have a Greek birth certificate. formulated in Greece, adopted by Rome, enshrined in the original teachings of Christianity, asserted by the Renaissance, proclaimed by the Enlightenment, reaffirmed at the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they have fundamentally shaped the political, economic, and cultural evolution of the world as we know it. This is not the first time the world has faced a similar threat. All the more reason why we should have known better how to read the signs. In 1933, when Hitler came to power and began to implement his aggressive policies, Western European governments showed complacency and lack of judgment, culminating in the Munich Agreement, similar to the inability of many political leaders today to learn from history. The signs of the gathering storm are there. Unprovoked use of military force, heinous crimes of war, constant threats against Western countries, including nuclear threats, physical elimination of opposition leaders, continued policy of ethnic cleansing in occupied Ukrainian territories, and of course, efforts to subvert European and American elections, influence our political parties, exploit pacifist tendencies, manipulate our news agencies, exacerbate our internal or external problems, and spread internet propaganda on a frightening scale. All this, combined with an ideological attack on democracy, which is denounced as a failed and irrelevant political system. In this respect, recent history could help us to identify the threat we now face on a global scale. History could also give us an idea of how to deal with it, avoiding the mistakes made almost 100 years ago, mistakes that cost so many lives around the world between 1933 and 45. But there is another answer to our conundrum, which is much more than an empirical conclusion based on a specific precedent. Rather, it is an attempt to identify values that transcend time, to understand the reasons why human beings inevitably seek a life of freedom. Once again, we must turn to history, albeit a much older history, but this time to a particular historian who so succinctly answered the question 25 centuries ago. Of course, as classicists, you know better than I that Thukydides is no ordinary historian. A keen observer of human nature, he theorizes like a true Greek, and often introduces philosophical observations referring to principles that guide human behavior, not so much as individuals, but as groups, peoples, ethnicities, and even in a broader sense, simply as human beings. You must now aspire to the example of this man, writes Thukydides in his second book of the history of the Peloponnesian War. He is referring to a commemoration of the dead Athenians, and it is one of the greatest political statesmen, Pericles, who is speaking. And he goes on to say, understand that happiness is freedom, and freedom is courage, and do not shrink from the dangers of war, for it is no real sacrifice for the disheartened to lay down their lives, for they have already given up hope. Rather, the best sacrifice comes from those who risk their continued happiness and have the most to lose if they fail. Το ΕΥΔΑΙΜΟΝ το ΕΛΕΥΘΕΡΟΝ, το ΕΛΕΥΘΕΡΟΝ το ΕΥΨΥΧΟΝ. In these three words, Thukydides sums up what was at stake in that era and what is at stake in our era. and in every era, when facing an enemy that wants to destroy democracy and freedom. At the same time, he guides us to find the path to freedom through courage. Some studies of this famous passage, so difficult to translate, find it strange that Thukydides uses neuter adjectives instead of nouns. To ΕΥΔΑΙΜΟΝ instead of ευδαιμονία, to ΕΛΕΥΘΕΡΟΝ instead of ελευθερία. These studies claim that this is a stylistic choice. I think it is rather an attempt to rise above the level of facts by defining concepts in their full scope, without being too philosophical, but rather seeing them from a more practical angle, which has to do with the role they play in human history. The one is not simply a condition for the other. In fact, these concepts are so inextricably linked that they practically overlap. He wants to emphasize as much as possible the connection between happiness, in the full range of the term, and political freedom in the full range of the term, as well as between political freedom and courage in the face of the dangers of war. What he's really trying to do by using this particular syntax is to establish a relationship of identity between concepts. Let me say at this point that I have always disliked the distinction between ancient and modern Greek. To my mind, there is only one Greek language that has been spoken for 30 centuries, a living, breathing language that evolves over time like any living organism. Being Greek is not a question of DNA. Language is the basic foundation of our national identity, transcending time, religion, statehood, or political systems. On the one hand, I remember my father praying in Greek, using the exact words drafted by the First Ecumenical Synod of 325 AD in Nicaea, a few kilometers outside Constantinople, the Nicene Creed, common to all Christians. On the other hand, every time I attend an Easter Mass in a tiny white church on a Greek island, I'm never sure whether it is Christ or Dionysus who is being resurrected. And when my school teachers refer to the concepts of good and evil, they always said to καλό, to κακό, or for just and unjust, to δίκαιο, to άδικο, using these neuter adjectives and never the corresponding noun. That is why the syntax of Thukydides seems so natural to me, and why I cannot agree that this is just an elaborate stylistic choice. Courage as the basis of freedom, and above all, freedom as the basis of happiness or prosperity, it's not just an idea we can find in one famous author. These principles permeate ancient Greek culture. We find them in Plato's philosophy, in the tragedies of Aeschylus, or the comedies of Aristophanes, in the speeches of Demosthenes, in the famous epigrams of Simonides, in the epic poetry of Homer, even in the lyric poetry of Pindar. They correspond to a very fundamental value which lies at the heart of the Greek civilization, which was in fact its most original innovation, namely the concept of perceiving the human being as the supreme value in politics, in art, in knowledge, in ethics. Undoubtedly, the necessary condition of the anthropocentric principle was the freedom of the individual. It is this concept of the value of the human being, and therefore the desire for individual freedom as a basis of eudaimonia, which we can translate prosperity or happiness, for every individual that was destined to prevail overwhelmingly throughout the world. It released human creative potential, opened new fields for science and research, generated new avenues for trade and commerce, unleashed innovation for artistic creation, led to new institutional ways of improving our quality of life through the rule of law and through political systems based on equality and justice. It is no mystery that this principle lies at the heart of the universal elements of our modern civilization. To all those who oppose our Western democracies and point out to our faults and shortcomings, I would like to point out their utter inability to explain the desire of most people in the world to imitate us, to live like us, to live among us. Even illiterate immigrants trying to escape a life of oppression and misery in their countries know deep in their hearts where they would like to find refuge. It is to Europe and America that they want to come and build a new life. As far as I know, no one dreams of moving to Russia or other authoritarian regimes. I don't think this is a coincidence. Ultimately, freedom as the foundation of prosperity has stood the test of time and prevailed against all odds, against tyrants and dictators. Not because Thukydides understood and clearly described the specific merits of the Athenian achievements, but because he correctly identified the tendencies of human nature itself, transcending time and ethnicity. But most importantly, it is the second part of Thukydides' logical equation that I believe it is critical to remember in order to deal with our current predicament. Courage is a prerequisite for freedom. It is a virtue that is increasingly difficult to find today, even in democracies, where half measures or inaction because of political cost and complacency are often the usual political reflexes. I remember President Zelensky, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, persistently repeating, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of threats. Don't be afraid of Russia." Fear is the most natural response to threats, but it is also the worst counsel in charting the course to be followed, as Churchill points out in his history of the Second World War. It is no coincidence that through history, autocratic regimes have used constant threats to instill fear in their opponents and implement their ruthless policies. A quick look at the Nazi German propaganda films of 33 to 39 will give you a typical example. They were designed specifically to frighten others, to paralyze resistance, and to lead to a policy of appeasement of Hitler. And in the reaction of the democratic governments of the time, it is easy to see how the counsels of prudence and restraint can become the agents of mortal danger. How the middle way, chosen out of fear or the desire for security and a quiet life, can lead directly to disaster. It is especially in difficult times that I envy those of you who study and teach Greek literature. In such times, we always need moral principles to refer to and beliefs from which we can draw strength. The study of the classics, whether Greek or Latin, provides us with an incredible range of tools for remembering our cultural identity, for reflecting on our intellectual and ideological origins. It is not about learning the grammar, the syntax, or the vocabulary of a dead language. It's about finding conviction in times of peril, when our achievements are challenged by external or internal political, ideological, or military forces. The decline of classics in most of the Western world, both in number of students and in resources, is an unfortunate development that must be reversed. These challenging times may be an opportunity to do so. Usually, even for those of us interested in the classics, it is hard to say for sure why the Greeks came up with the concept of human nature as the measure of all things. Why it was by the Greek civilization that the human being was considered to be the most important value in the great concept, in the great scheme, of things. A perception that explains, better than most other, the evolution of humankind. The shaping of the Greek landscape has certainly played its part. Landscape is not just a collection of land, vegetation, and water. It is a projection of a people's soul onto matter, defining who we are over the centuries. Tall, steep mountains that hide what lies on the other side capture the imagination. Hundreds of islands nestled on the horizon inspire curiosity and a thirst for knowledge. Barren land and poor agriculture create an impetus for colonization and exploration of other places. And all these elements of nature bring man closer to his true dimensions. Above all, the difficulties of communication led to the creation of city-states. The Greeks were forced to invent all kinds of political systems in each city that had one thing in common. They were based on the citizens, on their decisions, their labor, their ingenuity, their ability to defend their city. There was no pharaoh, no prophet, no high priest to reveal to them the supreme and unquestionable will of an all-powerful God. The individual had to take responsibility. The concept of the citizen led to civic duty and to democracy. But there is another element of a more metaphysical nature, which might be useful to mention. A number of Greek poets and philosophers observe that in our culture, an idea becomes a material element with astonishing ease. That under the clear, dry Greek light, one becomes friendlier, more familiar with the universe. In this small rocky corner of the Mediterranean, concepts seem to take shape almost naturally, leading to an anthropocentric view of the cosmos. There seems to be an element of incarnation in the Greek light that transforms human laws almost into physical laws, as Heraclitus first perceived. Ήλιος ούχ υπερβήσεται μέτρα. Είδε μη ερηνίες μην δίκης επίκουρη εξευρίσουσι. Which means that not even the sun can exceed the measure. Otherwise, the Furies, the helpers of justice, will punish him. So a human idea, a moral principle, becomes a natural law. Such an audacious notion is not to be found in any other culture before the Greeks. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides understood and responded to the elements of nature as we all do, but they built the moral and philosophical balance of their plays around the same key idea, including the terrible mechanisms of justice, hubris, and nemesis. Supreme moral laws that become natural laws, surpassing even the power of the gods and permeating all human destiny. When I read the first verses of Oedipus Rex, which describe the natural disasters that have befallen the city of Thebes because of the terrible crimes committed by Oedipus, and especially when I reach the famous verse, Ivris fitevi tyrannon, which means arrogance breeds tyrants, I feel a sense of reverence for justice, in the sense of an inevitable retribution that pervades both gods and men, and a sense of a collective moral code in the workings of the universe. The current situation in Europe is indeed difficult, but I feel that I should end my speech with a positive thought, which is only a natural conclusion to what I have said before. Despite the uphill struggle that democracies have to face in order to defend their freedom, both abroad and within their borders, despite the political prospects in some Western countries that often seem bleak, I would like to express my belief that the natural tendency of human beings towards freedom of thought or political freedom and prosperity will ultimately prevail. All other regimes, all other political solutions are contrary to the nature of our very being. And so I stand before you today in one of the oldest universities in the world, which has become a beacon of light even in times of darkness, with the sense that I'm addressing some of the worthy heirs of Greek civilization, with these words of caution, but also of hope. Allow me to place them in your care with humility. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very, very much for what you have remembered us. And coming from you, we are mainly scholars, teachers, students, researchers, and you are much than we are, because you have a responsibility different from ours. But what you said to us, personally, I feel, it comforted me in a way. It gave us hope, but also at the same time, the responsibility we all have as humans, the value of humanity, and your message was very important for all of us. I now give the opportunity to the audience, if you have any question, any comment. It's not every day that we have with us a special person like Mr. Vassilis Papadopoulos. So please don't be shy. Yes. Gonçalo, I don't know if there's a micro. No micro. We have plenty of micros, special micros, and we left them in our research center. So perhaps approach, or you try to speak with your powerful voice.
Okay, so I'll speak louder. Is that okay? I don't know if it's okay for you. Okay, so I'm Gonçalo Marcelo, a researcher and lecturer in philosophy here at our school. I think it's a clarification question, and let me begin by warmly thanking your intervention, Mr. Ambassador. You were we are all very horrified and afraid about what Mr. Putin is doing in the Ukraine, and we all cherish, I guess, the values of democracy, freedom, and are willing to fight for them and uphold them. At the same time, I also have the feeling that we all cherish the value of peace, let's say, and the European social model that we have been able to construct over the decades based on the welfare state and so on and so forth. So when you are critical of the undecisiveness and the half measures taken by, I would say, some European governments, just for clarification and taking into stock also this difficult trade-off, investing more in defense and perhaps less in other, cultural sectors and vital sectors for our societies. I mean, what would be more direct political decisions taken by European leaders? How far should we go? I mean, what would equate not to indecisiveness and half measures? What's your vision for how we should face this horrifying threat posed by Mr. Putin over the whole Europe? Just this question.
Well, it's a very good question. It's difficult to go into specifics because in each country there is a different situation, different approaches, different problems. I would say that it is good to read the first volume of Churchill's History of the Second World War, and of course Thucydides, because they both say, basically, that in order to achieve peace, we have to be vigilant and brave and not hesitate to take measures that sometimes are unpleasant. The most important for me is not to look abroad in what Russia is doing or what Ukraine is doing, but within our borders, to see if there are forces that are trying to influence political parties, business interests, or academic circles even, and use them as an instrument in order to create fear and appeasement. This is what I think that they're both saying, and that it is my opinion too, that they are correct.
Please, Federico.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your lecture. As Professor of Greek here at our university, and formerly at the University of Lisbon, I was delighted to hear you say that ancient Greek and modern Greek are the same language, because that's something I have all my life been saying to my students and my colleagues. And it's with some regret that now, after 35 years of teaching Greek, that I notice how unhelpful it is that we continue to try to pronounce Greek, the Greek that we teach, as we think it was pronounced in ancient Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. And that creates a barrier for our students when they go to Greece for the first time, for instance, and they realize that they can barely understand anything that a real Greek says, even though they can read words when they're written. But the barrier of the pronunciation is gigantic. And I was wondering whether, as a modern Greek yourself, and as someone who devotes himself to literature as well, and you're obviously a reader of the ancient Greek authors, what is your opinion on the possibility that we in our Portuguese universities should adopt the modern Greek pronunciation of ancient Greek, What's your feeling on that issue?
I think it's very hard to change a tradition of 5 centuries in European universities. In the beginning, I remember when I realized that in Europe they spoke with the Erasmian pronunciation, I was taken aback. It was a shock to me. Because, I was born in that country, and I thought it is natural to speak the way we speak Greek. But the important thing is not, to me, the pronunciation, is to realize what you said in the beginning, that the Greek of Thukydides evolved into the Greek of Apostle Paul in his epistole, and then it evolved into the Greek of Emperor Constantinos Porphyrogenitos, and then it evolved into the Greek of the poem of Eratokritos in Crete, and to the modern Greek. So I would say that the first step is to realize that the written language is a normal evolution, and in fact it is a more a slower, let's say, evolution than the evolution of French or English. I don't know about Portuguese. I wonder if the Portuguese of Camões is the same with the actual Portuguese. But every language suffers. Every language has to go through evolution in order to survive, like every living thing. Thank you.
Please, Carlos.
Mr. Ambassador, in an interview about your book, Diplomacy and Poetry, the case of the Yorgos Seferis, you said that Seferis is the modern tragic Greek poet. So in this context, in geopolitical context, and what means tragedy, what exactly would you say about? Is it the right moment to talk about this Nobel Prize, Seferis?
Seferis as a poet and as a diplomat, and I think it's because of his character actually, gave you the feeling that he bears on his shoulder the weight of the tragic fate of humanity and of the human being in general. There is no lyricism in his poetry. He is anti-lyric, with some exceptions of his poems concerning Cyprus. He always tries to see a subject from his philosophical view, from the view that concerns la condition humaine, human. There's no good English translation of this. And there is an attraction that I personally feel towards his poetry that is exactly due to the tragic feeling of the universe that it permeates this poetry.
Please.
Thank you, Master, for your lecture. It was very insightful. And thank you for the beautiful sentiments too. As a student of classics, it's always good to hear our occupation being praised by others. However, I wonder, as a representative of Greece abroad, do you have any concerns regarding the appropriation, the Western appropriation of classical Greek culture, and more importantly, the potential misuse of that perceived shared tradition?
Can you be more specific? What do you mean by misappropriation, and by whom exactly?
Well, the West seems to have appropriated classical Greek culture for itself, as if we all go back to ancient Greece when modern Greece is this true successor. And it comes to mind, for example, Nazi Germany, as yourself used as an example a couple of times, when using archaeology they tried to claim older Greek ancestry to the Aryan race.
I think that, well, first of all, we don't see it as appropriation. I mean, we think that Greek culture is an open culture that has enlightened many peoples around the world throughout many phases of history. So it's like an inheritance in a way. What each one of us does with his inheritance is his own problem, his own thing. Of course, what the example you mentioned is one of the cases that you cannot control. How persons can interpret your ideas once you pronounce them, or your thoughts, or your writings even. In the simplest things. Now, speaking as a writer, for instance, I write a short story. I want to say one thing, and others understand another thing. And I cannot interfere. I feel incapable of convincing them that no, it's not what I wanted to say. No. You should not even try.
Paula, please.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your wonderful presentation. I'm also a teacher of classical studies, Greek, Latin, and it was, I feel myself in the same words as Carmen said. It was very comfortable for us to hear you saying, talking about our roots and the things that we are always saying in our classes, and sadly, we feel sometimes quite frustrated not to be able to convince our public. But I want to ask you, as a Greek ambassador, as a representative for your state, nowadays we look at the role of Greece and the presentation and the public image of Greece. Well, do you think also? I think that, but I want to ask you, what is your opinion? Sometimes we feel that countries like Greece, Italy, and even Portugal and Spain, well, Southern Europe, are sometimes misrepresented as great today European cultures and as also big models. And Greece has a recent history from 19th and 20th century. Well, it is a country that faced difficult fights. It wasn't our case. In Western Europe, we were quite, well, it's not the case of Spain, but Portugal, yes. But you were really very, very attacked, very, well, you faced a lot of, you had to fight for your own freedom, considering the context of being at the frontier of big empires. What do you think? Do you think that experience, that your experience as the recent history of Greece, has something to teach us today in Europe as a way to fight also against tyrannic regimes, or against that lack of liberty, the same that you saw in 19th and 20th century, that you had to fight same things that we all, or we still see today in that same regions. I don't know if you understood my question. Sorry for my poor
Absolutely.
English. I didn't prepare my speech.
I think that sometimes I envy your country because it was never exposed to so many troubles, so many wars, so many problems. It was shielded in a way. In our case, it seems that history has condemned us to live again and again and again under constant threat and to struggle for our freedom. So we've learned to accept the fact that freedom is never granted. Not only from external enemies, but also from ourselves, I would say. You have to struggle to live in a democratic society, in the rule of law, and you have to struggle to avoid foreign interference or to be able to live in a more prosperous environment. It was never easy for us. So we had, and I'm telling you all this because not only because we had the First and the Second World War, we had the disastrous war with Turkey in 1922, and we had a huge, dreadful civil war. That's why I said, even among us, we had to look for freedom and to find out where we want to stand. But this is our history, and maybe it is to remind us again and again of what Thucydides was trying to say 25 centuries ago.
So if there's no more questions or suggestions or everything, any else? So I will ask you another compliment to our guest speaker, and I will finish this session. Okay, thank you very much.